What if I told you that the US government just shut down entire sections of Florida's coastline because marine researchers discovered something so terrifying beneath the ocean that it poses a direct threat to national security? We're not talking about typical sinkholes here. We're talking about massive oceanic cavities over 1,000 feet across that appeared seemingly overnight, expanding and contracting like they're breathing, with seismic activity that has engineers fearing for the structural integrity of Miami, Tampa, and Orlando. The Department of Defense has deployed deep-sea monitoring equipment. All marine traffic has been suspended, and what scientists are finding down there is reshaping everything we thought we knew about Florida's geological stability. Florida's coastline has always been a place of fascination, where tropical beauty and marine biodiversity converge with hidden mysteries beneath the waves. But in recent months, a team of marine researchers stumbled upon something far more unsettling than the coral reefs or exotic fish they were expecting. During a routine mission of hydrographic mapping in the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic waters off southeastern Florida, their sonar scans began to show irregularities, vast, dark voids opening along the seafloor. At first, the researchers assumed they were looking at what are known as blue holes, naturally occurring underwater sinkholes common around Florida's carbonate platforms. Blue holes, while mysterious, are fairly well documented, vertical shafts in the seabed that extend downward and serve as natural windows into ancient geology. But the anomalies appearing on their monitors were far larger, far deeper, and far more symmetrical than any blue hole previously recorded. As they refined their scans and deployed remote-operated vehicles, the truth became clearer. These were not just geological quirks, they were massive oceanic sinkholes, unlike anything ever documented at this scale so close to U.S. shores. Some stretched over 1,000 feet in diameter, large enough to engulf entire city blocks, and plunged more than 800 feet below the seabed into cavernous voids. Their size and perfect cylindrical shapes defied the usual behavior of natural karst systems, leaving the research team both stunned and alarmed. Even more troubling was what the exploration revealed about how they were forming. Unlike land-based sinkholes, which are usually caused by rainfall dissolving underlying limestone, these oceanic versions appeared to result from a complex interplay of subsea freshwater channels, trapped methane gas pockets, and deeper destabilization within Florida's continental shelf. In essence, forces from beneath the crust seemed to be hollowing out the ground beneath the ocean floor, creating structures that were neither stable nor inert. The deeper the researchers probed, the stranger the findings became. Sonar scans suggested that these voids extended far beyond their visible openings, linking into networks of hidden chambers. And unlike the slow, predictable erosion processes of normal sinkholes, these formations appeared to be opening at an alarming pace. So fast that satellite imagery from just a year earlier showed no trace of them at all. What the scientists had stumbled upon was not simply a natural curiosity, but a geological phenomenon unfolding in real time, one with the potential to reshape Florida's seafloor and threaten everything built along its coast. What shocked scientists most about Florida's oceanic sinkholes wasn't just their size, it was their speed. When researchers compared the latest sonar scans to satellite and sonar data collected just a year earlier, there had been no sign of these enormous cavities. Now, the seabed was marked by a sprawling network of vast depressions, almost like a spiderweb spreading silently across the ocean floor. The pace of their appearance defied geological expectations. Sinkholes on land typically develop over decades, sometimes centuries. These oceanic sinkholes were forming in months, perhaps even weeks. If you're finding this as fascinating and as unsettling as we are, don't forget to subscribe for more deep dive investigations into mysteries like this one. Remote operated. Vehicles sent into the depths confirmed that something unusual was happening far beneath the surface. Cameras captured sheer walls of collapsed limestone, rubble scattered across the floor, and fine sediment clouds drifting upward as if the seabed itself was still in motion. The geological collapse appeared to be ongoing, not an isolated event frozen in time. More troubling were the readings from the sensors mounted on these vehicles. Seismic monitors recorded subtle but consistent tremors, vibrations coursing through the seabed as though something deep within the earth was shifting. These weren't earthquakes in the traditional sense. They were smaller, rhythmic movements, pulses that suggested active subterranean processes. Hydrophones picked up eerie echoes reverberating from within the sinkholes, strange acoustic signatures that didn't match the sounds of marine life or natural ocean currents. It was as though the voids themselves were resonating, amplifying hidden movements beneath the crust. The anomalies didn't end there. As the sinkholes were monitored over days and weeks, researchers noticed that some of the formations appeared to expand and contract slightly, as if the seafloor itself were breathing. The changes were subtle, just a few feet across, but undeniable. When mapped over time, the patterns revealed a strange pulsation, a steady cycle of expansion and relaxation, driven by pressure shifts from below. This phenomenon hinted at something extraordinary: fluid dynamics and gas movement deep under the seabed, forcing water and sediment through semi-permeable rock layers. It was a process more akin to volcanic magma chambers than to anything typically associated with Florida's continental shelf. Except here, it wasn't molten rock inflating and deflating caverns. It was water pressure, methane gas, and geological stress combining to create a living, shifting underworld. The implications were staggering. If the seafloor was actively in motion, collapsing, breathing, shifting, then Florida was sitting atop a system not of static geology, but of dynamic instability. These were not just holes in the ground. They were evolving structures, unpredictable in behavior, capable of growing, merging, or even triggering larger collapses with little warning. For scientists, it was a clear sign that the ocean floor off Florida's coast was entering a phase of transformation, one that no existing geological model had anticipated. As the scope of Florida's oceanic sinkholes became clearer, the discoveries moved swiftly from the realm of science into the halls of government. What began as cautious reports from marine researchers quickly escalated into an urgent federal directive: a complete shutdown of the affected coastal zone. This was not a decision made lightly. Florida's waters are among the busiest in the Ihero nation, supporting everything from cruise tourism to cargo shipping to recreational fishing. Yet in a matter of days, traffic lanes that once bustled with commercial vessels fell silent. Cruise liners suspended their routes, rerouting passengers to other states. Cargo ships were diverted to ports hundreds of miles away, and entire fishing fleets were ordered to remain docked. Even leisure diving, an activity central to Florida's tourism industry, was banned outright. The sea lanes around the EE exclusion zone became eerily empty, patrolled only by government vessels enforcing the blockade. At the same time, offshore drilling and exploration operations in the Gulf were abruptly halted. Energy companies, already cautious about the risks of working in delicate marine environments, were told to pause all activity while risk assessments were conducted. Construction projects for underwater pipelines and infrastructure were stopped in their tracks. For Florida, a state deeply tied to its maritime economy, this shutdown sent shockwaves through its economy and communities. But for officials in Washington, the risks of inaction outweighed the costs. What truly underscored the seriousness of the situation was the involvement of the Department of Defense. Specialized naval ships equipped with deep-sea monitoring equipment arrived on site, their presence cloaked in secrecy. These weren't ordinary geological survey tools. They were advanced military-grade systems designed to detect the faintest movements beneath the seafloor, the kind of technology usually reserved for tracking submarines, not sinkholes. The deployment signaled that the government wasn't treating the sinkholes as mere curiosities of geology. They were being considered a matter of national security. The reasons were twofold. First, the physical danger was obvious. If the sinkholes expanded toward Florida's continental shelf, they could undermine coastal stability, contaminate groundwater systems, and even threaten cities perched precariously at sea level. But second, there was the issue of strategic infrastructure. Beneath these waters run vital communication cables, energy conduits, and shipping routes critical not only to Florida, but to the United States as a whole. Any instability in this region risked far more than tourism or fisheries. With naval operation, rerouted and surveillance ships stationed along the exclusion zone, the message was unmistakable. This was not simply a scientific challenge. It was a developing crisis at the intersection of geology, ecology, economics, and defense. Florida's waters, once celebrated for sunlit beaches and vibrant reefs, had become a restricted theater of investigation and caution. And as scientists and military officials worked side by side, one unsettling reality grew clear. The sinkholes beneath Florida's ocean floor were no longer a local curiosity. They had become a national concern. With global implications, Florida has always carried a reputation for fragility when it comes to its land and water. Much of the state, particularly in the south, is built on porous limestone bedrock. This type of stone is soft, riddled with natural channels and aquifers, and highly vulnerable to erosion. On top of this fragile foundation lies a human landscape of massive development. Skyscrapers in Miami, high-rise condos lining the beaches, sprawling suburbs, interstates, airports, and miles of critical infrastructure. And all of it sits only a few feet above sea level. That combination, soft stone, shallow elevation, and heavy urbanization, makes Florida uniquely vulnerable to any disturbance below the surface. With the discovery of the expanding oceanic sinkholes, those long-standing vulnerabilities suddenly feel like ticking time bombs. Engineers warn that if these sinkholes continue to spread inland or destabilize the continental shelf, they could undercut the very ground that Florida's cities are built on. The first and most immediate risk is to groundwater. Florida's aquifers, underground reservoirs that supply fresh water to millions, could be contaminated if seawater or methane seeps upward through fractured limestone. A collapse in the wrong place could poison drinking water, cripple agriculture, and set off a chain reaction of shortages across the state. Beyond water, the danger extends to Florida's physical foundations. Land subsidence, the slow sinking of ground caused by voids beneath the surface, is already a known issue in the region. But with sinkholes forming offshore and exerting pressure on the limestone shelf, the potential for subsidence grows far more severe. Whole neighborhoods could begin to tilt, crack, and sink if the ground beneath them is undermined. The image of cracked foundations and collapsing streets, once rare news stories, could become a widespread reality. The threat isn't limited to homes. Florida's infrastructure is in the crosshairs. Bridges that connect barrier islands to the mainland, vital highways like I-95 and I-75, and even major airports in Miami, Tampa, and Orlando all depend on stable ground. A chain of expanding sinkholes could weaken or destabilize these structures, forcing closures, evacuations, or even catastrophic collapses. Condo towers along the shoreline, many already scrutinized for safety after past tragedies, face new questions about whether their foundations can withstand shifting geology beneath the seabed. For city planners and engineers, the fear is not just about sudden collapses, but about long-term destabilization. The slow spread of sinkholes could gradually erode Florida's ability to maintain its infrastructure at all. Repairs would be constant, insurance costs would skyrocket, and the very idea of sustainable development along Florida's coasts would be thrown into doubt. What once seemed like paradise living could quickly transform into a precarious gamble against forces of geology no human construction can truly control. In short, the risks are existential. The same porous limestone and low-lying geography that make Florida unique also make it profoundly unstable. If the sinkholes continue to expand and multiply, the consequences will not be limited to isolated failures. They could challenge the survival of entire cities along the southeastern seaboard. While engineers and city planners worry about the fate of Florida's coastline, marine biologists are sounding the alarm about another crisis unfolding beneath. The waves. The sinkholes aren't only reshaping the seafloor, they are actively altering the delicate balance of Florida's marine ecosystems, and the changes are happening with startling speed. Sensors deployed into the sinkholes revealed unusually high concentrations of methane bubbling up from the seabed. In some cases, these methane seeps created cold water anomalies, sudden drops in temperature, as pressurized gas escaped into surrounding waters. Combined with shifts in oxygen levels, these chemical and thermal changes began to disrupt the fragile equilibrium of life offshore. Coral reefs, already stressed by warming seas and pollution, showed signs of accelerated bleaching in zones near the sinkholes. Entire patches of reef turned ghostly white, then crumbled into lifeless rubble. The impact didn't stop with the coral. Fish populations, once abundant in these waters, began to thin out dramatically. Sonar surveys that once revealed dents. Schools now showed empty stretches of water, with fish either dying off or abandoning traditional migration corridors. In some areas, researchers recorded abnormal behavior, species clustering in odd patterns, circling near methane seeps as though disoriented. Plankton, the microscopic foundation of the food chain, also displayed anomalies, with unusual blooms erupting in cold seep regions. These blooms created imbalances, producing oxygen-depleted dead zone that suffocated marine life in their path. Perhaps most disturbing were the changes observed in larger marine animals, pods of dolphins, and migrating whales, creatures known for their sensitivity to acoustic signals, began to avoid the exclusion zones altogether. Hydrophones picked up frantic vocalizations and disorganized patterns of communication. Some whales strayed far from their usual routes, even beaching themselves along Florida's shoreline. Satellite tags that once tracked the movements of sharks and sea turtles suddenly went silent, as if the animals had either fled beyond tracking range or perished near the sinkhole's depth. For marine researchers, these shifts were more than environmental curiosities. They were signs of a food chain under collapse. Coral reefs dying meant less shelter for fish. Fewer fish meant dwindling prey for larger species, and the ripple effect cascaded upward. Florida's coastal waters, long celebrated as some of the richest in biodiversity, were beginning to transform into barren stretches. The ocean here was no longer behaving like a stable ecosystem. It was acting like a system in distress, a biological warning flare signaling that the sinkholes were not just geological events, they were ecological catastrophes in motion. If these changes continue unchecked, scientists warn, Florida's offshore ecosystems could collapse within a generation. What once drew millions of visitors each year, colorful reefs, thriving fisheries, and charismatic wildlife, may vanish, leaving behind only dead zones and shifting voids where life once flourished. As researchers probed deeper into the sinkholes, they made a discovery that transformed the crisis from troubling to potentially catastrophic. Samples taken from the walls of these underwater voids revealed deposits of methane hydrate, a strange ice-like compound formed when methane gas is trapped within crystalline cages of water molecules under intense pressure and low temperature. Methane. Hydrates are sometimes called fire ice because, when lit in the right conditions, the frozen block burns with an eerie blue flame. Around the world, hydrates exist in the sediments of continental shelves, but they are usually stable and remain locked away, harmless. Off Florida, however, the hydrates surrounding the sinkholes were anything but stable. The walls of these formations appeared fractured and unstable, destabilized by shifting pressures, gas leaks, and the continual growth of the voids themselves. The danger is twofold. First, if even a fraction of these hydrate deposits collapse, vast quantities of methane could be released into the water and atmosphere. When dissolved in the ocean, methane depletes oxygen, creating lifeless dead zone where fish, coral, and plankton suffocate. When released into the air, methane acts as a greenhouse gas dozens of times more potent than carbon dioxide. A sudden surge could accelerate climate change on a scale scientists warn we are not prepared to manage. The Gulf Stream, which already regulates climate across the Atlantic, could be disrupted further by massive injections of gas and temperature anomalies. But the second danger is even more immediate and far more terrifying. Geological models show that rapid methane release can destabilize entire slopes of sediment along the seafloor. In other words, if large hydrate deposits collapse at once, they can trigger underwater landslides. These are not slow, creeping shifts, but sudden avalanches of rock and sediment tumbling down the continental shelf at astonishing speed. When such slides occur in deep water, the displaced volume can push up massive walls of ocean, tsunamis, capable of traveling hundreds of miles. Off Florida, the consequences would be unthinkable. A worst-case chain reaction, where one sinkhole collapse triggers another, could set off an underwater landslide stretching across miles of continental shelf. Within minutes, a mega tsunami could rise in the Atlantic, racing toward the southeastern United States. Unlike storm surges from hurricanes, which are predicted days in advance, such tsunamis could strike with little or no warning. Waves tens or even hundreds of feet high could slam into Miami, Fort Lauderdale, and the Florida Keys, overwhelming coastal defenses and erasing entire communities. The Gulf Coast, too, would be exposed, with water funneled into low-lying regions, like Tampa Bay and New Orleans. And because the U.S. eastern seaboard is so densely populated, the ripple effects could reach far beyond Florida, from Georgia and the Carolinas up to Washington, D.C. and New York. This nightmare scenario may sound speculative, but it has historical precedent. Scientists point to events like the Storegga slide off Norway some 8,000 years ago, when a massive undersea landslide triggered tsunamis that inundated coastlines across the North Atlantic. Now, Florida's unstable sinkholes, coupled with volatile methane hydrates, suggest a similar, and perhaps even larger, risk closer to home. For experts monitoring the situation, the presence of methane hydrates is the most alarming discovery yet. They transform the sinkhole crisis from a regional geological mystery into a potential global hazard. What lies beneath Florida's seafloor is not just a series of collapsing voids, but a loaded gun of climate and catastrophe, one that, if triggered, could send shockwaves across oceans and into the heart of civilization itself. As researchers compiled more seismic and geophysical data, a troubling pattern began to emerge, one that suggested the sinkholes were not isolated cavities, but part of a much larger, hidden process unfolding beneath Florida's continental shelf. What started as unusual depressions on the seafloor was beginning to look like evidence of profound geological forces at work. Seismic readings hinted at tectonic microplate activity, the subtle shifting of smaller crustal fragments beneath the southeastern United States. For decades, Florida was considered geologically stable, far from the fault lines that plague the Pacific coast. Yet now, harmonic tremors and microquakes suggested otherwise. The data implied that beneath Florida's seemingly calm foundation, stresses were building and releasing in ways scientists had never recorded in the region before. Adding to the mystery were signs of hydrothermal emissions detected around several sinkholes. Remote-operated vehicles captured footage of fissures venting streams of superheated fluids, rich in minerals and chemicals. These emissions looked eerily similar to the hydrothermal vents seen in volcanically active zones thousands of miles away. Their presence hinted that Florida's seafloor may not be the passive, dormant landscape geologists once believed, but part of a concealed geothermal system long overlooked. Some researchers went further, proposing a radical hypothesis that Florida sits atop a hidden geothermal corridor or even a newly forming tectonic fissure system. If correct, this would mean that deep beneath the limestone and sediments, molten rock and pressurized fluids could be reshaping the crust. The sinkholes would not be mere collapses caused by erosion or methane leaks, but surface expression of an underlying system in motion, a system closer in nature to volcanic processes than traditional karst sinkholes. The most unsettling evidence came from the seismic signature of the tremors themselves. Instruments detected harmonic tremors, low, continuous seismic vibrations typically associated with magma movement. These signals are not random quakes or collapses, but steady pulses, as though something deep underground is resonating. Such harmonic activity is most often recorded beneath volcanoes before eruptions, raising questions that once seemed unthinkable. Could Florida's seafloor be showing signs of volcanic-like behavior? If these interpretations prove accurate, the implications are staggering. A hidden tectonic fissure system could destabilize the entire southeastern shelf, threatening not only Florida, but neighboring states. Hydrothermal emissions could alter ocean chemistry on a vast scale, further compounding ecological disruption. And if magma or pressurized fluids are indeed on the move, the possibility of new vents, eruptions, or explosive seafloor events cannot be dismissed. For now, scientists remain divided. Some caution against leaping to volcanic explanations, suggesting instead that methane releases and sediment collapse could mimic harmonic tremors. Others argue that the convergence of evidence, seismic activity, hydrothermal emissions, fissures, and the pattern of sinkhole formation points to processes far deeper than conventional geology can easily explain. What is clear is that Florida, once thought of as geologically uneventful, is anything. But the ground beneath its waters may be far more dynamic, unstable, and unpredictable than anyone had ever imagined. The sinkholes, once seen as isolated anomalies, may in fact be early warnings of a seismic and geothermal awakening beneath America's southeastern coast. While geologists and engineers wrestled with the seismic mysteries of the sinkholes, marine biologists descended into their depths and uncovered a revelation just as astonishing, one that hinted at forms of life unlike anything previously documented in the region. Far from being barren voids, the sinkholes turned out to be thriving laboratories of evolution, harboring creatures and colonies adapted to extreme conditions that most organisms cannot survive. The first discovery came from water samples drawn near the sinkholes' dark interiors. Scientists detected microbial colonies that appeared to function without oxygen, metabolizing methane and sulfur compounds instead. These microbes, completely alien to Florida's known ecosystems, clustered in dense mats along the sinkhole walls. Under the microscope, they displayed unusual shapes, some forming crystalline lattices, others weaving into filament-like structures that almost resembled living cables. The implication was profound. Life was not merely surviving in these oxygen-poor conditions, it was flourishing in ways that challenged established biology. Then came the sponges. Along the rims and ledges of several sinkholes, divers and robotic explorers identified strange sponge-like organisms never before catalogued. Their bodies pulsed faintly with bioluminescence, glowing with hues of blue and green like lanterns in the abyss. Tests revealed their tissues were infused with trace amounts of rare earth metals, elements like neodymium and yttrium typically found in deep mineral deposits, not in living organisms. The question arose, were these creatures actively extracting metals from their environment, or had they evolved symbiotic relationships with the mineral-rich microbes colonizing the sinkhole walls? Even more baffling was the behavior of larger deep-sea animals observed near active sinkholes. Schools of fish, normally chaotic in movement, swam in tight synchronized spirals around methane vents. Crustaceans scuttled in regimented lines, almost as if following invisible patterns. At one site, cameras recorded a gathering of bioluminescent squid that pulsed light in coordinated sequences, like signals in a hive mind. These hive-like behaviors suggested that the animals were responding not as individuals, but as parts of a larger, synchronized system, a phenomenon rarely seen in higher marine life outside of simple swarming instincts. Scientists proposed several theories. Some believed the creatures were reacting to subtle acoustic vibrations from the sinkholes, essentially entrained by the rhythmic pulses of seismic and hydrothermal activity. Others speculated that chemical gradients, methane, sulfides, rare minerals, were shaping behavior through neurological or sensory pathways not yet understood. A few even argued that entirely new symbiotic relationships might be emerging, where multiple species linked their survival strategies together in response to the extreme conditions. For the scientific community, these findings were nothing short of extraordinary. The sinkholes were not only geological anomalies, but biological crucibles, breeding grounds where evolution was bending into unfamiliar shapes. The microbes hinted at pathways for life in oxygen-starved worlds, perhaps even on other planets or moons. The metal-infused sponges pointed to biotechnologies and biomaterials unknown to science. And the synchronized behaviors of deep-sea animals raised unsettling questions about intelligence, communication, and environmental influence at depths where humans could barely survive. Yet with wonder came unease. If life could adapt so radically, in a matter of years around these sinkholes, what else might emerge as the phenomenon continued? Were these behaviors signs of resilience, or signals of ecosystems mutating into something humanity has never encountered before? The sinkholes were no longer just threats to Florida's geology or coastlines. They were portals into new frontiers of biology, blurring the boundary between natural adaptation and something far stranger. The sinkholes are not just a scientific or geological crisis. They are now reshaping the very foundation of Florida's economy, and by extension, the economic stability of the United States and even global markets. In Florida, the first sector to collapse was tourism. The state has long been a magnet for beachgoers, divers, and cruise passengers. But as soon as news of the oceanic sinkholes spread, followed by a sweeping federal shutdown of coastal zones, Florida's once bustling resorts emptied out. Cruise liners that once sailed daily from Miami and Fort Lauderdale now sit docked, their operations frozen indefinitely. Coral reefs that drew divers from around the world have been declared off-limits, either closed by federal order or killed by methane leaks and rising ocean temperatures. For a state where tourism generates more than $100 billion annually, the impact has been devastating. Thousands of jobs in hospitality, entertainment, and service industries have vanished almost overnight. Fishing communities, too, have been gutted. With coastal waters deemed unstable, federal and state authorities banned commercial fleets from venturing near the sinkhole zone. Once plentiful fish populations have thinned or vanished entirely, forcing seafood markets to import supplies at skyrocketing prices. Generational livelihoods along the Gulf and Atlantic coasts of Florida are collapsing, with some towns facing economic ruin. The disruption extends far beyond tourism and fishing. Florida's major ports, Miami, Fort Lauderdale, and Jacksonville, are key arteries of international trade. With large portions of the seafloor deemed unsafe, shipping routes have been forced to reroute, creating delays that ripple across the country. Cargo once bound for Florida is being diverted to ports in Georgia, Texas, and the Carolinas, straining infrastructure and inflating shipping costs. What began as a regional hazard has quickly spiraled into a nationwide supply chain disruption. Energy companies are facing their own crisis. Offshore drilling platforms in the Gulf of Mexico have been ordered to suspend operations, both to protect workers and to avoid further destabilizing the seabed. These facilities supply a significant portion of U.S. oil and natural gas, meaning the shutdown is already pressuring energy markets. Analysts warn that prolonged disruption could compromise American energy security, forcing heavier reliance on foreign imports at a time when global supplies are already volatile. Meanwhile, another silent but powerful industry has begun to panic: insurance. Florida's coastal real estate, from Miami's glittering condos to luxury resorts lining the Keys, has always carried some risk due to hurricanes and rising seas. But with the sudden, unpredictable emergence of sinkholes offshore, insurers are scrambling to reassess their models. Preliminary estimates suggest premiums for beachfront properties could triple or more, if coverage is even offered at all. Some firms have already begun pulling out of the market, leaving homeowners and developers stranded. For a state where much of the tax base and wealth is tied to coastal development, the implications are staggering. And because Florida is not isolated, the tremors of this economic collapse are echoing worldwide. Investors are pulling capital out of Florida real estate and tourism ventures. International cruise companies, many of them European, are suffering catastrophic losses. Global seafood markets are tightening as Florida fisheries disappear. Energy futures are spiking on speculation of long-term Gulf production losses. What began as an underwater geological anomaly has become a cascading economic disaster. Florida, once synonymous with sun, leisure, and growth, is now seen as a high-risk zone. The sinkholes are not only swallowing parts of the seafloor, they are consuming confidence in one of America's most vital states, with shockwaves rippling across global markets. As weeks turned into months, one fact became increasingly clear. No one fully understands what is happening beneath Florida's water. What began as isolated discoveries of massive sinkholes has grown into a puzzle that defies simple explanation, pulling scientists, governments, and international agencies into a race to make sense of the phenomenon before it escalates further. 1. School of thought looks deep into the past. Geologists point out that during the last ice age, sea levels were far lower. Florida's continental shelf was dry land, riddled with underground caverns and vast aquifers carved into limestone by rain and freshwater rivers. As the ice melted and seas rose, many of these caverns flooded and collapsed, creating the famous blue holes seen today. Some researchers argue that what we are witnessing now may be a continuation of that ancient process, the collapse of massive subterranean chambers that have lain dormant for tens of thousands of years, only now destabilized by shifting pressures. Climate-driven sea level rise or methane buildup deep below. But there are troubling signs that this is not just Florida's problem. Satellite mapping and sonar surveys reveal similar anomalies appearing across the wider Caribbean basin. Strange depressions forming off the coasts of the Bahamas, Cuba, and even the Yucatan Peninsula. These sites, though smaller than Florida's, sinkholes, show the same signatures: methane hydrates, acoustic anomalies, and unusual biological activity. Together, they suggest the possibility of a regional geological shift, a massive, interconnected system awakening beneath the Gulf of Mexico and the Western Atlantic. If true, the scale of the threat would expand dramatically, potentially destabilizing ecosystems, economies, and coastlines across multiple nations. Yet, despite the mounting evidence, official information remains scarce. Government agencies issue carefully worded statements about ongoing investigations and routine monitoring, but avoid addressing the scale of the crisis. Naval surveillance vessels, however, continue to patrol affected zones, deploying classified monitoring buoys and deep-sea probes. Leaked reports hint at a growing recognition within military and intelligence circles. The sinkholes are no longer just a scientific curiosity. They are being treated as a strategic and ecological crisis, one with potential consequences for national security, energy infrastructure, and even global stability. And so, speculation fills the vacuum. Some fear the sinkholes are precursors to catastrophic landslides or mega tsunamis. Others believe they may mark the birth of a new tectonic fracture system, rewriting geological maps of the region. More speculative voices suggest geothermal corridors or processes that blur the line between familiar Earth systems and planetary-scale mysteries. For now, the truth remains elusive. Scientists are divided, governments are secretive, and the ocean itself continues to reshape without pause. Florida's sinkholes stand as both a warning and an enigma, symbols of how little humanity truly understands about the hidden forces beneath the sea. The question lingers: are we witnessing a temporary anomaly, or the opening chapter of a geological transformation that could reshape the southeastern United States and the Caribbean for generations to come? Until answers arrive, uncertainty remains the only constant. The story of Florida's oceanic sinkholes remains unfinished. For every discovery, the methane hydrates, the microbial colonies, the seismic pulses, new questions rise from the depths, each more unsettling than the last. Governments have moved to silence speculation. Scientists struggle with incomplete data, and communities along Florida's coast live under a shadow of uncertainty. What lies beneath the surface is more than a geological curiosity. It is a reminder of how fragile our world truly is, balanced on forces we neither see nor control. The ocean is vast, ancient, and largely unexplored, and these sinkholes have torn open a window into that hidden reality. Whether they are remnants of the Ice Age, signs of a regional tectonic shift, or the first tremors of something far greater, the truth is still buried beneath miles of dark water and shifting earth. The only certainty is that Florida's sinkholes have become a turning point, a convergence of science, ecology, economy, and security that will shape the future in ways we can barely begin to understand. For now, the sinkholes remain, expanding, shifting, breathing, silent sentinels of the deep, keeping secrets that no satellite, no sonar, and no human eye has yet fully uncovered. The world waits, watching the waters of Florida, knowing that in those depths lies a mystery with the power to alter everything. We thought we knew about the planet we call home, but this mystery cannot stay hidden forever. The more voices that question, the more pressure placed on those in power, the closer we move to answers. Share this story. Stay informed. And remember, the sea has secrets still waiting to surface.